for the chill in relations between the two countries, Pakistan and the United States. Relations between the two have alternated between close engagement and deep estrangement. So it's really had its highs and lows, ups and downs. So my task at that time, my diplomatic mission, was to work on the erosion and elimination of multi-layered sanctions that had been imposed by the US on Pakistan. The then Prime Minister, the late Benazir Bhutto, was able to persuade President Bill Clinton about the futility of sanctions and the need for a fresh start in our relations by resolving the issue that had festered for so long, which was the issue of our embargoed military equipment, which included planes and other equipment that we had paid for, but which were never delivered to us. And of course, the removal of economic sanctions. So here was the challenge. New legislation was required to override the law that Washington had invoked in response to our nuclear program. But at that time, both houses of Congress were not controlled by Democrats, but by Republicans. So the Clinton administration, of course, which is a Democratic administration, had limited influence to ensure that this law was passed in the form of what came to be known as the Brown Amendment, because it was named after a senator who initiated this move. So we at the embassy in Washington were asked to do the heavy lifting and the lobbying. So the first stop, of course, was the 100-member US Senate, as that's where the amendment was first introduced. So the challenge we faced was, of course, to build a public-private coalition to make the case for the legislation and to make the case for Pakistan. So we reached out to senators, to the media, think tanks, and of course, influential interest groups that had, weight with many of the senators. So, we undertook hectic diplomacy and lobbying, and eventually this led to success and adoption of the amendment, and therefore the release of our equipment and the easing or the removal of some of the economic sanctions that were in place. Now, in my second term in Washington again, the professional challenge was even greater, as I had to deal with the situation in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. So other than dealing with the Bush administration, one had to engage in public diplomacy, because that also became an urgent and pivotal task. Again, this meant reaching out to members of Congress, to the media, as well as to think tanks. So, that gives you a sense of how a diplomat has to go about achieving the goals that the country sets for them. So my assignment involved intense public diplomacy, undertaking in an arena, in an environment where the possibilities for unconventional diplomacy are enormous. I mean, Washington is a place where really you can engage in a lot of unconventional diplomacy. And, there really is no, there's no primer. There's no how to do book that can help you in the game of changing perceptions and influencing hearts and minds. I believe that much of it is learned on the job by first understanding the environment in which you're functioning, and then fashioning a strategy that is implementable. But what did help me were the communication skills that I had learned and acquired over years as a journalist. So at that time, the entire international focus and the focus in the United States was in Pakistan. I suddenly realized that I was expected to not just represent my own country, but also speak for the Muslim world. And undertaking this daunting mission threw me in a world of often ill-informed presumptions and preconceptions, if not outright misperceptions about both Pakistan and Islam. And there was lots of stereotypes out there and caricatures, especially of Muslim women. So I had to challenge all of this through diplomacy by soundbite, whether I was at the Hill lobbying or I was on the media, but I had to constantly do this. So this was the most, I would say, testing experience of my career, but also in hindsight, fulfilling, as this unprecedented spotlight on Pakistan gave me a great deal of airtime, which is, very rare for the envoy of a foreign country to get, because the US is so inward looking, if you like, and, focused on itself. So I really had this opportunity to explain, to articulate our position. And this opened up an opportunity to try to change the skewed and the misinformed thinking about my country. My next assignment, and that was the last assignment that I did, which ended 2 years ago, and I completed my tenure there, almost 5 years, was as Pakistan's permanent representative and ambassador to the UN, which I started in 2015. And it was perhaps the most rewarding of my, entire diplomatic career, because, you're in a way, and you know this very well, you're envoy to the whole world. And being envoy to the whole world, 193 countries represented at the UN in New York, it really expands your horizons in ways that other assignments don't. So, multilateral positions really open up your mind, and it kind of, introduces you to countries that you know very little about. But at the end of your term, you have learned a lot about them, their culture, their politics, their interests, and what their priorities are. But at the UN, I observed four major dynamics, and I thought I'd share those with you because you might find them useful. One, the dominant dynamic at the UN is cooperation, not confrontation, even though we compete in many ways. So you learn to accommodate each other's interests and align your country's interests to the larger collective interest. So while you do represent your country at the UN and you're pushing your own agenda and your country's priorities, you come to understand and respect other nations' interests and operate to a very large extent as a global citizen, dealing with international issues, global problems, in which we all have shared interests and common goals. The second dynamic, of course, is an obvious one, but I think it needs to be restated. And that is, no country can go it alone at the UN. Countries have to cooperate with others to achieve what they have to achieve. And this, despite the composition of the Security Council, to which I will return later within the UN system. Even members of the Security Council, of course, they are the more powerful members of the United Nations, but even they cannot alone do much unless they have others on the council cooperating with them. And third, we negotiate at the UN as blocks. So on development issues, for example, Pakistan is a member of the Group of 77 and China. On political issues, Pakistan is a member of the Non-Aligned Movement, the Organization of Islamic Countries. So, you have the EU, you have these groupings that on political issues operate, as a bloc. And that's how they negotiate. Four, I think what you also see in an increasingly multipolar world is the dispersion and redistribution of global power that is being reflected now at the UN, with powerful states having to consult much more with the rest and having to answer to the rest. I mean, only recently there was a General Assembly resolution, I'm sure you followed that news, which is a new one, which now requires Security Council members, whoever's exercising a veto, to explain to the General Assembly, because the General Assembly then will come into session 10 days from the exercise of the veto, something along those lines. And it has to therefore justify why it used the veto. Now, my own country's engagement, and therefore my engagement at the UN, extended to all three pillars of the UN system: peace and security, development, and human rights. And of course, within peace and security, one has many other issues: arms control, disarmament, all the things that come under this rubric. And Pakistan's engagement at the UN has involved both hard and soft power. For example, in the realm of ideas, personalities from my country, such as Dr. Haq, Mehboob Haq, have had a far-reaching contribution to make. The notion of human development was actually operationalized by him in a seminal UNDP report. Then the architect behind UNFPA, which is the UN's family planning agency, was a Pakistani woman. Her name was Nafis Sadiq. So, she was the person who thought of this and headed it, the first head of UNFPA. Now, in terms of hard power, Pakistan has for decades been amongst the world's top and most consistent contributor to UN peacekeeping. So we have, since 1960, contributed over 200,000 troops to various missions in over 40 countries, mostly in Africa, to help keep the peace and therefore to demonstrate Pakistan's commitment to upholding international peace and security. Now, Pakistan's engagement and standing is also reflected in its repeated election to key UN bodies. For example, we have served 7 times in the Security Council as a non-permanent member. Every decade, in fact, since we joined the UN, we have served on the Security Council. We have been elected 5 times to the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And of course, we've been elected to numerous other UN bodies, including as a member, we were elected as a member of the executive board of UNICEF. In fact, I was, it was an honor for me to serve as the president of UNICEF's executive board in 2015. Now, I mean, I'll turn to an issue and then, I'll round off on this point so that you can initiate some questions and, ask me whatever comes to your mind about the UN. I think right now we're witnessing a growing wave of skepticism across the world about the UN. And the question that is being asked is whether the UN is fit for purpose, whether it is in sync with what the demands are of the 21st century. Now, much of this disillusionment is directed or focused on the peace and security pillar of the UN, which is, of course, as you know, the responsibility of the Security Council. And as the world's premier crisis management body, the Council is widely seen to have fallen short on its principal role. I mean, its failure to resolve long-standing disputes and ongoing crises, and in the case of Kashmir, in my region, occupied Kashmir, to enforce its own resolutions, and in Palestine also, its failure to enforce its own resolutions are all seen as glaring aspects of the Security Council's persistent failures. And this brings up the issue of reform, of Security Council reform, for which the process of negotiation has been going on for over 2.5 decades, with little agreement emerging on the fundamentals of reform and with no solution in sight. Now, the principal reason for the persisting impasse in negotiations for reform of the Security Council is the gap in position between those who want to add more permanent members to the Council and those who feel this would only reinforce its dysfunctionalities. In fact, paralysis of the Council, the stalemate that we often find, actually is attributable to the differences that exist between permanent members of the Council and the fact that they possess a veto, which they can exercise. Now, 4 countries, the G4, they call themselves, Brazil, Germany, Japan, and India, have actually been spearheading the move for expansion of the Council by adding more permanent seats. While Pakistan, along with Italy, we have formed a group called the Uniting for Consensus Group, and we advocate democratic reform of the Security Council and expanding it not by adding more permanent members, but by more elected non-permanent members. So, we're opposed to the creation of more permanent seats, as this, we believe, would be contrary to the defining principle of our age, which is democracy and elections. So, we would like to see a council that is more representative of all member states, whether they're small or large, and not the council being, just a club of the privileged and the privileged few. So any reform effort, we believe, should be consistent with the democratic spirit of our time. And we think that more elected members will make the council more transparent and inclusive and also accountable to the larger membership. So, in a nutshell, we believe principle should rule over power. And, we would like to see, for example, many proposals have been offered by the consensus, Uniting for Consensus group. One such proposal is that we'd like to see 11 more elected non-permanent members added to the council. But let me just say that the position of the permanent members is key for any reform to take place. Apart from the stalemate that I mentioned, there is also the question of what the permanent members themselves would like to see. Because any increase in the Security Council membership will require an amendment to the UN Charter. And for that, a resolution will have to be adopted by a 2/3 majority of the General Assembly. And then in a given time frame, that charter amendment based on the resolution will have to be ratified by at least 2/3 of UN member states, including the 5 permanent members. And only then will this reform be actualized. But I do believe, and I'll round off here and then turn to you for your questions. However challenging and difficult the process of reform may be, but at a time when we are witnessing so much global turmoil, and when we see that a rules-based international system is facing unprecedented challenges, an important way to strengthen multilateralism would be to strengthen the role of the UN. And this in turn, this objective cannot be achieved without a comprehensive reform of the Security Council. So let me with that hand it back to you, the moderator, for your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador, for very open talk and for your remarks. And I already have a few questions in my mind based on what you have talked through that regards the UN Security Council and general UN system. And the first question is, you have mentioned your experience and talked about it extensively in the US, where after all these events that caused a lot of conflict in the world, and in the period of sanctions and embargoes. And we see now in the world that there are countries that are facing these kind of sanctions and a lot of criticism, both internationally and in many countries bilaterally as well. So I'm wondering, how do ambassadors of these countries feel when they have to leave and they have to negotiate and still speak with the officials of those countries that are very much heavily criticizing their governments in their capitals? So it's very interesting. How did you feel facing all of these tough questions and this criticism around that was hanging in the air?
Countries obviously move according to their interests. But at the same time, when I was lobbying to get these sanctions off my country, I was appealing to the principle of justice, fairness. And I was saying, are you able to achieve your objectives by coercive means, or are you able to achieve your objectives by engagement? And I think that's the choice that any country that is imposing sanctions, has to confront or make. The choice is, sanctions is, you impose sanctions and you lose leverage over that country. That's it. But if you continue to engage with that country, there is a good chance that you may be able to, promote your objectives. So the point that I used to make was, especially on the Hill, because, we were working for a legislative, initiative, and the administration was in our support. So, we didn't have to convince the administration, but we did have to convince members of the Congress. And my personal experience was that they were very willing to listen. And I think the argument of fairness appealed to them. Otherwise, we would never have achieved our objective. And I think the fact that we said that, look, you embargoed our equipment and you kept our money, at least give us our money back. If you can't give us our embargoed equipment, so be fair with us. Even if you don't want to remove the sanctions, please, can we have our money back? So, so they're used to many times, of course, many of them never knew this. So the first task is to inform them. They are people dealing with domestic politics primarily. And then some of them who serve on foreign affairs committees, naturally, they are dealing with foreign affairs, but they don't have intimate information or knowledge about what a specific country's problems are. So I think the first task is to, make sure that they are well informed. And then, we take it from there, that you appeal to their sense of fairness. And it worked in the case of my country. But obviously, if, for example, the administration had been, wanting to continue the sanctions, then it would have been very difficult. We would not have been able to succeed.
You're right. I think the situation now is very different, and many countries are lacking fairness, unfortunately. And in sense of fairness has been eroded very much ever since. And actually, my question is related also to Pakistan's nuclear program, and it proved that the conflict never escalated ever since. And now looking at Ukraine and Russia, also two bordering states. Also, let's say that used to be a part of one state before, and just having the analogies and seeing what is going on currently, to me it shows once again that the decision to actually have a nuclear program probably helped avoid the bigger war in your region. Wouldn't you think so?
Yes, we certainly believe. Pakistan has always regarded its nuclear program for defensive purposes. We have no interest in using it to parley our power. It's not something that we want for power projection. Some countries acquire nuclear weapons for power projection. We acquired nuclear weapons, our nuclear capability, as a defensive measure. And I think if you look at the record, Pakistan and India, who had been to war 3 times before the nuclear equation was established, there was no war after 1971. And the nuclear factor, we believe, has something to do with this. Maybe a major factor is the nuclear deterrent, which prevents the outbreak of war. Of course, we've seen difficult relations between the two countries, tensions, skirmishes on the border, on the line of control that divides Kashmir, but there has been no outbreak of war because the two nuclear neighbors know the consequences of escalation, and therefore war has been averted.
Yes, and this is very also important and relevant for the world security, generally speaking. And you mentioned also reforming the Security Council, which also became a more visible issue once again after the conflict in Ukraine broke out. And what is generally your thoughts, and what are your thoughts on there is huge move now to abolish the veto power per se? What would you suggest on that?
I don't think that is a realistic possibility. I think the effort now is to limit the use of the veto, because abolition of the veto will require all 5 permanent members of the Security Council to voluntarily relinquish their most important power. Let's not forget that Russia, which has used the veto the most, the United States number 2, China, very few vetoes have been used. UK, France, again, they've not needed to use the veto, but they have used the veto over time. But the 2 countries that have used the veto a great deal is Russia and the United States for their own interests. And it was the Russian veto on the Ukrainian conflict that led to this move in the UN General Assembly on behalf of all the members, because it was a consensus resolution to not limit, but in a way make the veto user more accountable to the general membership. So abolition, I don't see as a realistic prospect until the abolition of 5 permanent members, which I don't see anytime soon. They have no reason to give up nobody gives up their power voluntarily. But I think this sense that this unequal sort of membership, obviously the 5 members wield much more power than other members of the United Nations. So there is a desire on the part of the rest of the members to have some degree of accountability by the permanent five.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. And also you mentioned and you spoke a lot about lobbying and negotiating in the UN. And we also see a lot of these so-called vote trade in the UN when different countries exchange votes. Would you agree that this is, or what would you say, how can this practice be made more fairer? Because supposedly, you know, all these different expert bodies and all these different organizations should have people who, and should have hired people and experts based on their merits, and maybe not only on politics and on the wishes of the bigger states. How do you see this trade in vote be balanced?
I think countries do assess candidates, whether they are individuals or it's a country that is contesting a seat, to some extent on merit. But you're right, a lot of it also involves, trading, if you like, that if you support me in this election, I will support you in that election. So there's a lot of that. And don't forget that it's regional groups that also try to evolve a consensus amongst themselves about who they're pitching for a particular seat. For example, Pakistan is a member, so is Afghanistan, so are other countries in Asia. We are a member of the Asia Pacific group. So, we kind of get together and decide amongst ourselves that if our region is being given representation on a particular body, then who should be the candidates. So, so there is prior consensus that, sometimes you don't get the consensus, but many times you do get the consensus. So the regional consensus becomes a very important sort of building block for what happens in the next sort of stage of the election process at the UN. But yes, you're right. I mean, I think countries do decide on the basis of what we call reciprocity, which is, we will do this if you can reciprocate by then supporting us, perhaps in election to another body.
Right, a lot of inequality actually is being institutionalized in the UN, from what we are seeing in the Security Council, and also around different other issues and veto powers. Now I would like the audience to ask us questions. Also, those who are watching us live, you can write a comment on Facebook and we'll ask the ambassador the question. And also those who are in the audience, if you can please unmute yourselves or write in the chat and contribute to the discussion.
I see Ramiz is there. He should ask a question.
Hello, Ambassador. Hello, Isma. Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Ambassador, for giving us your time, for being here with us today. It's a great honor to have you in our Youth in Diplomacy Talk series. It's our 10th Youth in Diplomacy conversation, and we're so happy to have you here. I remember when I was Afghanistan's youth representative to the United Nations, when I was speaking at the Security Council, your seat was right next to me. So I remember that moment, and I have the honor meeting you there, and we all have the honor having you here in our conversation. I would also like to apologize for the delay in starting this meeting. We rely on technology so much, sometimes it can be difficult to rely on technology. Ambassador, you have a very, very inspiring diplomatic career. I've read your articles. I hope I will have the chance to read your books as well that you contributed to. There are a lot of problems going on today in our world, and young people are very concerned about it. I'm concerned about it. My colleagues are concerned about it. We talk about it very much. And that's why we have these conversations with experienced diplomats to have their perspectives on different global issues, for example, the situation in Afghanistan, the war in Ukraine, and other issues, for example, COVID-19 and the rise of authoritarianism in the world. You called the Taliban's recent decision to decree on women they have to cover their faces and be at home unless it's necessary, according to them. You called this on your Twitter as tragic.
Mhm.
What else do you think the world can do about it? How we can help women and girls in Afghanistan to have their rights. You also called it a call back to 1990s, which is, I believe, even worse than that. What do you think we can together do to support women and girls in Afghanistan and address this challenge through diplomacy and through collective action?
I think, first of all, Ramiz, you're a very persuasive person because you're the one who persuaded me to do this talk. So we owe this to you. So thank you for asking me. And it's a pleasure to be talking to all of you. It's a very good question. I think the only way that we can influence the Taliban, and it doesn't mean that we will succeed, but at least we make an attempt, is if the international community acts together. Look, one of the things that the international community has done is to withhold recognition. No country, including mine, has recognized the Taliban government. I think that's important because they continue to want recognition, even though every country, I mean, whichever country is interested, is engaging with the Taliban. Lack of diplomatic recognition has not stopped engagement. And of course, as you know, humanitarian assistance is going via the UN bilaterally. Pakistan is also helping. Now, these are all ways in which you can try to influence the Taliban. But I think what is happening, from what my friends who are well-informed journalists tell me, is that there is a power struggle within the Taliban between the let's say the more ideological minded people represented by the supreme leader, their supreme leader, and the others who are, let's say, relatively more moderate. And this power struggle is playing itself out. I mean, if you look at what happened to schools that were shut all of a sudden, schools beyond grade 5 or 6, they were announced that there was an announcement that they would be opening. And then late at night came a directive and a decision from Kandahar, from the supreme leader, that no, we mustn't open these schools. And even the education ministry and officials didn't know, but they had to carry out this order. So, there is a power struggle. Now, how does the international community influence? I think influence will still have to be pursued through engagement. Because, we were just talking a little while ago before you joined, that frankly, censure and sanctions don't really, they actually push a country into isolation. And then the country has no, in a way, it has nothing to lose by behaving the way that it does. But for me as a Pakistani woman, obviously I want to see my Afghan sisters enjoy the same rights and access to education that I see in my own country. So, when I tweeted that, of course, it was heartbreaking to see that women have been told that they are supposed to not even leave home unless it's absolutely necessary, and that they have to cover themselves. I mean, it should be left to women voluntarily, whether they want to cover their head or they want to cover their face or not to. This is not, I mean, at least in my country, this is not for the state to do. It's a choice that women have to make up themselves. So, I think, Ramiz, the international community has to continue to, in a way, also remind the Taliban leadership of the promises that they made. They made commitments on terrorism, on women's rights, on having a more inclusive government. So we have to hold them to these promises, and only by acting together and not be divided, that perhaps we can influence the Taliban.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the answer. I think Lika had a question, another former UN Youth delegate. Lika, you can unmute if you are with us still.
Yes, thank you, Esma, and thank you, Ambassador, for your very interesting talk about your experiences with the United Nations. I will introduce myself. My name is Lika Torikashvili. I am a former youth delegate of Georgia, and together with Ramiz 2 years ago, we started this network. And we've been working on a lot of different projects ever since. And in fact, I have two questions and remarks to you, Ambassador. One of them, both of them are a bit of criticism towards the United Nations, although I do agree with the quote that we saw at the headquarters that the UN is not created to prevent hell, to create heaven, but to prevent hell from happening. I do agree with that, of course, and I believe in the power of diplomacy, but I also believe that we are the generation who can change a lot and reform a lot and show how with action we can achieve more than with talking and talking and talking and talking and talking and talking, as we see it happening at the United Nations. So two of my remarks, first of all, something that we are experiencing right now as young professionals is the problem of internships at the United Nations and the unpaid internships that we usually bring up with all the ambassadors that we talk to as an issue for young people to start contributing and really raising their voice at the United Nations, because when you're 23, it's really hard to afford to live in New York and also work at the unpaid work at the United Nations. So one of them is how do you start a career at the UN, given that the entry is so difficult because of that, and because of high requirements on degrees and work experience. So first question and remark would be on that and on your experience of starting your career at the UN. And the second remark, and actually just sharing with you, one of our projects, we do work on a lot of different SDGs, and we try to provide solutions to some of the most difficult issues around the world. And of course, one of the issues was education in Afghanistan. And up until pretty recently, the universities remained closed. And one of the things that our network proposed and actually implemented half a year ago was enrolling Afghan university students in online classes. And Bennington College, an American university, participated in this and opened up their classes for students to engage in online education online from Afghanistan. And this model was very successful, and for the past year, 12 students have been participating and getting credits from an American university. And of course, it was not public because we could never reveal the names of students who participated. But we suggested this model, in fact, to the UN Youth Envoy and UNICEF and UNFPA, and we hope that they would help us provide internet. So the main issue was internet provision to the students, because more students could have joined, but they couldn't because they didn't have access to technology. So we started implementing this, and the university was on board, but to continue the project, we only need internet provision. And again, we did have discussions with the UN, but didn't have much support. So little things like this, networks like ours, and young people like us, really trying to get in touch or get in somehow and get minimal kind of support, but failing. So how could we change that, and how could we be more heard? That is my question. So two related or maybe unrelated questions, but really interested in your responses to them. Thank you.
I think they're very good questions, and I really appreciate your remarks. I think they are very important, and they're very insightful. I think it's very important for young people to be engaged with the UN, not least because of what I had described. There's a lot of skepticism about global governance today. So one way that you overcome and address this skepticism is you have greater engagement with those who are going to be tomorrow's leaders. So young people. So I am a total I believe in that passionately. Now, unpaid internships, I agree with you. I think these internships should be paid. But remember, the UN is a pretty resource-starved organization. In fact, I can tell you a little anecdote. When I first met the present Secretary General, because when I arrived there, it was Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And so when I first met Antonio Guterres, I said, Secretary General, what a pleasure. And he said, just call me secretary, don't call me general, because I have no money. So and I said, I'll remember that quote of yours. But I think what he was trying to say was something serious, because what he was saying was that, we really are dependent. Obviously, they're dependent on donations from countries. And that was a particularly difficult time because, it was the time of President Trump, who, as you know, was not a great believer in multilateralism or in fact, the United Nations. So there is this problem of financing. Now, many UN bodies, UNICEF and others, they also rely on private donations other than donations, donors, which are countries. So there is a financial issue, I think, but somehow this should be overcome, because I think if people are going to be interning there, it should be professionalized, the internship system. Now, as for, difficulty in reaching out and, first of all, there aren't enough internships because, again, resources and space requirements, I think, or space limitations should I say. So there's that aspect. The other is that it's hugely competitive. Remember, people from 193 countries are competing. So it's tough. So when you say that their requirements are tough, yes, you're right, they are. But the one thing I can tell you is that while people are applying, countries do not influence. And I think that's a good thing, because then it's on merit. So it may be, on merit, which is a very high standard. But for example, if there's a Pakistani candidate for something, I can't use my influence and ensure that the person gets into the program or gets a job there or gets an internship there. This is entirely on merit. This I can vouch for. So I think that's a good, positive thing. But the rest of your criticism, I think, is valid. But I do think the youth envoy should be the one that should be used to channel, some of the points that you have made, which is, lack of access. They should be listening much more, and they should be better in their outreach to young people. For example, the UN needs to do more in different countries because there are UN offices everywhere, right? In my country, we have huge UNDP programs. Different UN agencies are here. But I never really see many of them, in a way, doing, networking with young people. Perhaps at that level also they need to, so that more people are engaged with them. And then young people are also able to make their voice heard to the UN, resident missions in different parts of the world.
Thank you, Ambassador, for this. And I will build on Lika's question that we talked a lot about youth engagement in the UN and the UN work. And you have been seeing that few countries did have UN youth delegates while during your mandate as of ambassador. And you have seen also Ramiz speaking in front of the Security Council. Had you ever considered maybe of advocating in front of your government for Pakistan to also have the UN youth delegate?
Yes, very much so. I sent written communication as well as I made representations because many young people from my country and the couple of people who used to come there to attend different meetings would raise this point with me. And also because, you know, I really believe in this. I think if the UN has no relevance in the eyes of young people, then we're really missing something. We're really losing out. As I said, the next generation of leaders comes from young people.
Yes, hopefully we will see the government response, and we'll see maybe the Pakistani UN Youth Delegate within a few years joining our network. Would be very great. My final question would be about being a woman and a diplomat, and the first female diplomat from a given country. So you mentioned that you essentially were appointed as an ambassador during the leadership of a female prime minister. Do you think that had played a positive role in your appointment, in generally promotion of women to different positions? And also, if you could maybe comment on the situation with Malala, that we see that she's not able to return back home to her country due to the security reason. And this is very concerning, especially since all the things that is going on. And we see that people are being more open towards women around the world, but still it's unfortunate that she's not able to go home and even visit.
Well, let me say that the person who appointed me when I first started my diplomatic career was the first elected female prime minister of a Muslim country, Benazir Bhutto. So yes, you know, she clearly saw the need to promote women, but on the basis of merit. Because I think, you know, when she offered this job to me, I asked her, I said, you know, how much does gender have to do with it? And she said, well, first is merit, first is your capability, and then, so it's not my principal reason, but it is a factor. And I thought that was a very honest, and almost touching answer, you know. So I do think that, you know, it does help. I think the more women who are seen in these positions, the more they are able to, in a way, act as role models, encouraging other women to also, you know, join the foreign service or take up public positions. So it's important. As far as Malala is concerned, you know, that's a decision only she can make in terms of security. But today, security in Pakistan is nothing compared to the time when she was shot by a member of the Pakistani Taliban. I mean, Pakistan has succeeded in virtually defeating the militant groups and terrorist organizations. That doesn't mean it's been completely eliminated, but it does mean that we've come a long way from the time that we used to have bomb blasts going off almost every day in our major cities and elsewhere. So now, yes, there are intermittent attacks, but you know, there is no bar on Malala returning. I mean, I know her myself, and I think she's you know, such a courageous a person who's done so much for so many causes: education, clearly, women's rights, etc., girls' education. She spoke out on Afghanistan situation when the Taliban closed schools beyond grade 5, grade 6. So, you know, I mean, she's an amazing, extraordinary person. But as I said, you know, there's nothing to bar her return. I think it's perfectly safe for her to come. But as I said, this is a decision only an individual can take. You know, I can't decide for her any more than anybody else can. You know, that's something that she has to determine for herself.
Right. Well, very, very understandable. I want to ask if anyone, all the other participants may have any questions or comments.
Thank you, Isma. I have a question, Ambassador. Could you please reflect on your new article on the new, with the title "New Fault Lines for Pakistan"? If you can share a summary of that article with us.
I think what I was writing about was the confrontation that we see right now between the government and the opposition, and the sharp polarization in the country. Now, this is not unusual because we see in many parts of the world this kind of polarization. We saw it in the United States. We still see it in the United States. We see it in India between extreme religious forces and more moderate, secular-minded people. So, Pakistan too is confronted with this polarized polity. And so I called that a new fault line. And I was sort of, in a way trying to argue that it's important to overcome some of these differences if the democratic system is to function. Because as you know, Ramiz, democracy only works if there is mutual accommodation, there is tolerance of the other, and there is consensus. But if you adopt a position of my way or the highway, then the democratic system is undermined. And I think when it's undermined, then you let down the people who've elected you. People have elected you to solve their problems. People haven't elected you to, get into a boxing ring and start boxing with each other and fighting all the time. I think there's general public disapproval. And the public becomes very skeptical then, of politicians fighting all the time. So the expectation is of political leaders that please think of the public interest, think of the problems that you have to resolve. And, obviously Pakistan, like many developing countries, has, it has an economic challenge, it has an educational challenge, it has many challenges that it has to meet. So the responsibility of political leaders should be to focus on these and to involve themselves in problem solving rather than in, confronting each other and having a zero-sum view of politics that your loss is my gain, so I have to somehow make sure that you keep losing and I keep winning. I think, one of the points that I also made in that was not quite in the same language, but I think increasingly it's not the ethic of sport that guides political behavior, it's the ethic of war. Sport is about winning and losing. So, you may lose today and you may win tomorrow, and I have to accept that. But in war, if politics becomes war, then you want to eliminate the other. You want to defeat the other, and in a way eliminate them, from the political scene. And that obviously is not helpful for the evolution of democracy.
Thank you, Ambassador. I actually have two more questions. One, there are a lot of concerns about the rule of Pakistan in support of the Taliban for a very long time. There have been a lot of evidence shared on that as well. The Taliban leaders, they have homes in Pakistan, they have businesses in Pakistan, there are religious madrasas in Pakistan that are training Afghan children. They are there in those religious madrasas. They return back to Afghanistan. Most of them have joined insurgent groups. Those evidences have always been shared with the Security Council. Afghan politicians have always been complaining about that and coming up with different sorts of evidences around that. So I'd like to hear your perspective on that. And second question is the relationship between India and Pakistan. Do you think peace is possible between India and Pakistan when these tensions will be reduced? These two countries can't live without each other. These two countries can't basically live with this amount of tensions and conflicts between each other. Do you think the conflicts and the tensions between India and Pakistan can be resolved through diplomacy and people-to-people engagement?
Well, your first question, Ramiz, yes, there has been this view about Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban. First, let me go back to the 1990s, when we were one of three countries that actually recognized the Taliban government. Even at that time, we had a very testy relationship with the Taliban because the Taliban were engaged in practices that we never approved of. So it's not as if we've had this perfect relationship, because the Taliban's worldview and our worldview, are pretty far apart. We've never endorsed the Taliban's ideological sort of position. What they would like to see in Afghanistan, even now in the 21st century, in the year 2022, is not something that we'd like to see in Pakistan, to be honest. So, so much for the 1990s. Now, during the 20-year war that the US engaged in, and NATO countries engaged in Afghanistan, we felt from the very beginning that this war will never be won, because military means will not lead to any kind of solution. And therefore, we continued to say publicly and otherwise also that engage with the Taliban, make a distinction between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, because it is Al-Qaeda that attacked the United States at 9/11, not the Taliban. And therefore, if they wanted to see some kind of a political solution, it had to come through a negotiated end to the war. Now, by advocating that, I think the impression that was formed was that Pakistan had become somehow very, in a way, we had become we were speaking on behalf of the Taliban. We were not speaking on behalf of the Taliban. As I said, we have our own interests and the Taliban have their own interests. Then the other thing, I think, we kept our communication channels open to the Taliban. Yes, because we didn't have the luxury like the United States did to one day pack their bags and leave the region and go to the other end of the world. We live in this region. But it was that communication channel that then helped get the Taliban to the negotiations with the United States in Doha, which paved the way for the withdrawal of the United States. I mean, unless they had that agreement, they would not have withdrawn. You know the whole history. So I think it's a much more, it's much more complicated than this simple sort of view that many hold. And, they, of course, they're entitled to their view that somehow, Pakistan was sort of backing and wanted the Taliban to win. In fact, we were the ones who kept agreeing with the international community that the Taliban should not militarily take over Afghanistan, that a political settlement must be found so that, there is the kind of power sharing that would lead to stability in Afghanistan. Of course, that didn't happen, but that had nothing to do with us. That had to do with the way the withdrawal took place and the way the Taliban found support amongst the rural community in Afghanistan. Now, we do not approve of some of the things that the Taliban are doing. We have security problems because of the TTP, which is the acronym for the Pakistani Taliban. They are still based in Afghanistan. We keep talking to the Taliban leaders and asking them to contain this group, to dismantle this group. So, this is not some kind of a, it's not as if, it is a difficult relationship. But as a neighbor, and because, since Afghanistan is a landlocked country, everything in a way has to go by land, it has to go, through transit through Pakistan. So, neighbors have no choice but to be neighbors. You can't pack your bags and, move to the other end of the world. So the relationship, I think, with the Taliban will continue to be, I think, problematic in the months to come because of the manner in which they are conducting themselves. And I think, they have to adhere to the promises that they have made, not just to us, but to the international community on terrorism, women's rights, etc., human rights, and so on. India, it's more complicated. It's hard for me to answer that in the next, I think we'll be closing soon. But, obviously it's the long history of tension, 3 wars, unresolved disputes, the dispute of occupied Kashmir being the principal one, but there are other disputes also. Now, Pakistan would like to resolve these issues by negotiations, by finding political settlements to these disputes. But you need 2 to tango. We need a partner for peace in the region. And I think right now, India under the Modi government it's becoming more difficult because they're the ones who called off the dialogue between our two countries some years ago. And then, of course, they went in and illegally annexed Kashmir and made it part of the Indian Union in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Now, that has made the environment, it's vitiated the environment, made it more difficult to resume the peace process. But Pakistan is still ready, able, and willing to resume the peace process, provided that peace process is result-oriented. It aims at resolving disputes. I mean, we don't want to just engage for the sake of engagement and pretend everything is normal when it isn't normal. But clearly, I mean, this region with its high levels of poverty, it needs the two neighbors to be talking to each other, cooperating with each other, focusing on addressing poverty and underdevelopment in their countries. But to do that, it's important for them, for both countries, to resolve their disputes. And, as I said, we are ready to resume the peace process, but that peace process must be predicated on resolution of issues, principally Kashmir.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's my last question before we wrap up, and that would be your perspective about our network. We're a group of former and current UNU delegates from different countries, different backgrounds, different experiences, working together to promote the role of young people in diplomacy and try to do our part in resolving some of the global problems through talking and listening and through diplomacy and promoting negotiations. So your perspective on what we do in our network, because we're a young organization, and your advice to us, if you could please share with us.
I think it's a great initiative. I didn't know much about it until you got in touch with me. And I'm very pleased that I was able to have this conversation with all of you. I think, you need to, in a way, network more, connect to more people, expand your network. And I think have a presence on the social media, because in many ways, that's how you connect. Now, this may be going out on Facebook, but I think it's also important to, set up have your own Twitter account, named after your network. Youth in Diplomacy. Maybe you already have one. I don't know about it. You do. Okay, sorry.
Your account under our network's name, and we're following you.
Okay, excellent. So perhaps you need to publicize that, because I should have known about it. I'm sorry I didn't. But perhaps if more people come to know about it, you should be on Instagram, because a lot of young people, as you know, are on Instagram. And I think much happier people are on Instagram. I find people on Twitter are very angry most of the time. So, Facebook, you're already there, sure. But I do think that, one way in which you spread the message and also get noticed, because the UN will sit up, or UN bureaucrats will sit up and take notice when they say, oh, this account has millions of followers or tens of thousands of followers. So we'd better take these guys seriously, So I do think, today the digital tools we have at our disposal really gives us an opportunity for an outreach that we never had, let's say, 10 years ago. It was very difficult. But now we have these tools. So I think using these tools to spread your message, which is a very good one, which is, sort of in a way motivating young people to be more engaged in diplomacy, engaged with multilateral processes, which are all about international cooperation and peace. I mean, what better message for this time, which is a time of turmoil, war, and turbulence, than your message? So, I would say good luck to you, and I hope you can spread this message much more.
Thank you, Ambassador, very much for good wishes. And yes, indeed, we need to be, and we are trying to attract more audience, and we want to pursue, because we see that not so many UN youth delegates end up either in the foreign services of their countries or at the UN, and we would wish this reality to be changed. Unfortunately, yes, I also would add that polarization happens not only within the countries but also around the world, between the countries. And we were yesterday, me and Lika were just discussing how much has happened just in 1 year with this exacerbation of conflict around Israel and Palestine, and then the situation in Afghanistan, and now the war in Ukraine. And we see that actually not only the former Soviet countries are now wishing to join the NATO, but also Finland and Sweden. And unfortunately, probably more will also follow in terms of polarization internationally, and more countries will be forced to take sides. Thank you very much for your today's time and your commitment and your time spending with us. It was very interesting personally for me, and very inspiring talk. And also thanks to all of our audience who were watching us either on Facebook or attending here on Zoom. And thank you very much. And we are waiting for you all, the youngsters, in our upcoming Youth in Diplomacy